Daniel 3 and Daniel 4 tonight. We may not get very far through Daniel 4, but we'll give it our best shot. So these are long chapters. Chapter 3 is 30 verses long. We won't read it, although it probably would be a good thing if we did read it together. But what I'd like to do is ask you, let's talk through the main features of the plot line in this story. So this story, you know, if this were a class at school, this story is generally about what? Who are the characters and what's the issue? And then we'll get to specifics in the plot line.
Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar.
All right.
Yep.
Who else?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's right.
And I don't know their Jewish names.
Yeah, let's see.
Hey, I want to tell
Yeah,
you a little story that I heard a really long time ago, and it'll mess you all up. That little boy went to church one Sunday without his parents, and when he got home, his mom asked him what the sermon was about, and he said it was about the housing problem. And she said, "The housing problem? How is that? But tell me about it." He said, "Well, I don't know, but he talked about my shack, your shack, and a bungalow."
And a bungalow. Oh, I know.
yeah, let's see. Their Jewish names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Azariah, Hananiah, Mishael.
Okay.
Mishael.
My shack, your shack, and
My
a,
shack, yeah.
and a bungalow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll never forget that.
Right, so the three names we hear of them most often are their Babylonian given names that all have some reference to Babylonian gods. And their Jewish names all have some reference to Yahweh. Okay, so we got the characters. What is the plot line? What happens, and then what happens, and then what happens?
Well, he made an image of gold.
Okay, so who's he?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar the king makes a big tall statue of gold. How big is it?
60 cubits. 90.
Yeah, 60 cubits, so about 90 feet high. A cubit is generally a foot and a half. There's variation, of course, but a cubit is understood to be about a foot and a half, 18 inches. And so 90 feet high, how wide?
9 feet wide.
9 feet wide. It's a little bit hard to
Sounds
picture
like an
that.
obelisk. I
Yeah,
mean, it's tall
Yeah.
and skinny.
I mean, you know, the Washington Monument is a lot taller than 90 feet, isn't it? It is. It's like 200 feet.
Something's pretty.
Yeah, yeah. So that's not, but it's more than 9 feet wide, you know, the base. So it's the Colossus of Rhodes, you know, one of the 7 wonders of the world, was taller than 90 feet. So, but still, for the sake of the story, it's good to get a picture. All right, so then what? So then he builds a statue. Where does he put it?
The plain of Dura.
Okay, the plain of Dura, okay. I don't know exactly if archaeologists have conclusively determined where the plain of Dura is, but what I have seen is northwest of the city of Babylon. So kind of up the river. Okay, all right. So then what does the king do after he builds this statue?
He calls all the
Send
important people.
government officials and tells them to fall down and worship the image of gold.
Yeah, so all these governors, satraps, prefects, officials from all over the realm are summoned to where this statue will be. Now let's, you know, I'm gonna kind of go back and forth here a little bit, but let's try to imagine all those officials being called from all over the realm. I mean, all over the this is a case of, I mean, in actual fact, it's probably not likely that they literally came from all over the place. So there's a purpose to the story here that adds to the, you might say, the impact or the drama of the story. Okay, so they come, and what are they supposed to do?
Bow
That's
down,
Bow down and worship, okay? And what do they do?
do it.
Right.
Do it.
Okay, then what happens?
If they don't do it, they get thrown into the furnace.
Okay? So
Somebody
after-
somebody rats out the three Jewish guys that they
Yeah,
didn't
so-
bow.
Right, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are among the officials. Right? They should have been in that scene where everybody's bowing down. And they're not there. And my version says that these other officials denounce them to the king. I don't know what word your version uses, but denounce, is somebody have a different word?
Accused.
Okay, accused, all
is
right.
what mine says.
Denounce seems like a really strong word to me. Okay, so then what happens?
King summons the three.
Right,
Four.
and how does it describe the king's emotions?
Oh, he's in a rage.
He's in a rage,
Rage.
right? So now they're summoned to meet the king, and then what happens?
He gives them another chance to bow down.
Right. And their response?
No, thank you.
Okay, how, a little more detail, how is their response described?
They said, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, then God will either take care of us or we'll die, and either way we'll be with God.
Right, but what we're not gonna do is bow down and worship. Just that verse or two there, and can you, how do you imagine these three men saying those words to the king?
Well, one thing that I just noticed is that they say back to the king, you know, we are not going to bow down to the image of gold. I'm wondering if they're hearkening back to Sinai. They certainly would have known it as a Jewish boy.
The golden calf.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good possibility, because there are all kinds of little echoes of memories like that, yeah. Yeah, the image of gold,
I suspect they're very polite, but very firm.
okay? All right? Respectful but firm, so not fearful at all. Okay, then what happens?
Nebuchadnezzar was furious.
Yeah.
He threw it in the furnace.
My version says his visage changed against them.
Yeah.
Like, I think he liked them. I mean, obviously he did, because he put them in charge
Right,
of stuff.
yeah.
Changed his mind
Yeah.
pretty quickly about.
Yeah, his face, I think my version says his face was distorted. Now, back to the golden statue. Here we might think back to chapter 2 and the dream he had. And it's possible that the readers and the hearers of this story are meant to think back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2, which talks about the face, right, of in the dream, the head, okay? And that's Nebuchadnezzar's head. So on this statue, perhaps, in chapter 3, we can imagine the image of Nebuchadnezzar's head and face. And you can imagine, stately, regal, firm, that maybe kind of pleasant, you know, I mean, under control, but here, I mean, the kind of between the lines is Nebuchadnezzar is throwing a little bit of a temper tantrum, you know, and his face is distorted. So by comparison to that image of the statue in the dream, okay,
So I
Yeah.
did wonder, did Nebuchadnezzar think that as a result of the dream he had permission or, to build the statue? of
perhaps,
gold?
yeah. Yeah,
It's almost like a calling.
yeah, that's as I've been describing from the scholars that I'm following in trying to do this study, these are stories that in one sense can stand alone, but clearly they're meant to be read, like we're supposed to kind of keep these things in mind from the earlier stories. And I've got to, we'll come back to that question.
I wonder if making the whole thing in gold is kind of a saying that I'm going to be eternal. I'm not silver, bronze, and iron. I am gold all the way.
Yeah, and I mean, there's real hubris here. And by the way, where did that gold come from?
Yeah,
Jerusalem.
the temple.
Exactly. This is from the temple. I'm fuzzy on the number. I think 100,000 shekels of gold. That would be a lot of gold taken from the treasury of David in Jerusalem. So yeah, Deborah, there's a fair amount of vainglory working here. Okay, so they say we're not going to bow down to the image. Then what happens?
He has them bound up and they heat the furnace to 7 times its normal heat level and throw them in. And then those that bound him up died because of the flames.
Right. So try to imagine what kind of furnace they were thrown into. And one description I read, a big metal cauldron, because death by burning was one of the ways kings executed people. So a big metal cauldron with a hole in the top and a hole on the side so you could see what's going on. But here's my question, and I'm not a chemist. I don't know like the chemistry of fire and all that, heat, thermodynamic. How do you, I know more oxygen, for example, will make a fire burn hotter, but 7 times hotter,
Right.
And then you shed most of the time.
right? So here's the number 7.
That may be an exaggeration.
Right, it is an exaggeration. Now, I mean, it's hot enough that these guys die who are tossing them in the fire. But some exaggeration here. This is one of the reasons the scholars I'm following say these are as much stories as they are histories where they're telling us something that actually happened. It's taking probably some true story, so to speak, and embellishing it for these particular theological purposes. And this might be part of that, an example of that sort of characteristic of these stories. All right, so they're thrown into the fire. Then what happens?
King
don't
sees 4 people in there.
Yeah.
Who looks into the fire?
The king.
Ezra.
Right, not the servant. Why is the king doing the looking? Right, but he does. He's the one who does the looking. And as Larry says, there are 4 people in there, and the 4th one has what kind of appearance?
White.
Okay.
White.
And yeah, there's more to the description. So your version says son of man?
No, it doesn't. I was remembering.
Mine
It says
says
son of
the
God.
form of the fourth is like the son of God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
son of
sounds like
God
that.
or a heavenly being. Yeah, clearly a supernatural presence
Right.
in the flames. And what are the four of them doing?
Just walking around unharmed.
You're just walking around in the fire. And then what happens?
Nebuchadnezzar has them come back out.
Right. And how is their appearance described?
Not a hair on their head was singed.
And they don't even have the smell of fire on them.
Right.
Again, we get this, yeah,
But their bindings, their ropes, whatever, were gone.
right.
They were unbound.
Yeah, they're unbound.
They are?
They're free.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah,
But the didn't come out, just 3 of them came out. Right?
right,
Yeah.
right. The fourth person, the fourth being doesn't appear in the scene after the fire in the furnace. All right? Okay, who talks next?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. And what does he do?
He has changed his mind about God.
Praises the angel that rescues the servants,
Yeah,
as
My
he saw
version-
it, an angel.
Mhm.
yeah. Verse 28, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Blessed be that God. So he goes from blaspheming God to blessing God. And then what happens?
Makes a decree that everybody is gonna
Yeah,
worship that or honor that
gonna
God.
honor that God. So another decree, and again, if you don't abide by the decree, you're gonna be torn limb from limb. You know, it's this language again, very.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a cartoonish picture here of Nebuchadnezzar, kind of, very subject to his feelings, and he kind of runs from one extreme to the other. But at the end of the day, this king, and here's the historical background to keep in mind. He is the king of the largest empire in the world at that period of time. So, somebody that you wouldn't want to mess around with. And here is this king acknowledging the God of the Jews. All right, that's the plot line.
Does it actually say that he commands people to worship that God? Mine just says that they can't say anything against him.
Yeah.
Right,
Ah, there
Yeah.
you go. Mhm. Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, that's good catch there, yeah, so. Can't say anything against this God. Now, even from a, not even from a Jewish point of view, but from a kind of a typical pagan point of view, he can still believe in his own gods, Nebuchadnezzar can.
Yep.
And he knows, okay, the God of the Jews is a powerful God, we don't want to offend him. So we've gone at least that far. And from the biblical perspective, what we're seeing here is God providentially protecting his faithful people. That's really
So Steve, is
yeah,
it, that anyone who speaks amiss against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God is gonna be cut to pieces, their houses made into a dunghill, blah, blah, blah. Is that, because to dishonor, to speak ill of this powerful God is going to be harmful to our kingdom? That
perhaps,
kind of thing?
sure, yeah. Yeah, clearly you don't mess around with this God,
Mhm.
right?
But I guess I'm wondering why why the punishment like that?
Well, as I understand it, again, I think this is part of the way this story gets told, this kind of exaggerated, characteristic of Nebuchadnezzar. So I wish I could, maybe somebody can help me here, but you know how sometimes we speak in metaphorical terms when we're really intense, we feel intensely about something, and we might say something like, I'm gonna rip your head off. You know, now we're not gonna do that, but it gets the point across, right? Probably something like that is in this story. Now, a king issuing an edict normally would be, you gotta take that very seriously. But in terms of the way these stories are told in Daniel, the focus is on God's sovereign power. We are in exile. We're in a foreign land. We've lost all of our securities and all the things we held dear, and now we're in this place. And these stories say God is still with us. It doesn't guarantee that we won't die or suffer, you know, doesn't guarantee that, but he's with us and he'll bring us through.
But
And
it's
that-
even more so than if they were back in Jerusalem. And, I mean, God is there, like with them, almost like standing next to them. You know, and
Right.
it's like we don't see that when they're in Israel necessarily.
Right, yeah. So I think it's good for us to try to imagine people living in exile telling these stories and remembering the truth and leaning on the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Steve?
Okay, yeah, Jim.
It isn't written as a conversion experience for Nebuchadnezzar.
Mm-mm.
Not chapter 3.
It's more of a matter, I think, to me, what I hear him saying is he met his match or seen his match, and he's going to make sure he doesn't make that match mad. But,
Right,
but he hasn't really adopted that God for himself.
that's right, that's right. He has been bested by a higher power. Yeah, good. Okay, again, scanning through the chapter, and hopefully you've read it, you're familiar enough with it, you can, what references and descriptions get repeated?
Well, the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors are named several times.
Right. Right. Okay, what is the purpose in telling a story like this of that sort of repetition? Like we want to go, okay, we know who those people are. You've said that once, that's, you know, so why the repetition? And I'm asking you to think in terms of literary style. What does repetition typically do?
Reinforces a point.
Yeah, it emphasizes, right? We're emphasizing something.
I think it's the point that this was really important people here. We're not talking about the commoners. We're talking about really important people that saw this and knew this
Yeah.
had happened.
Yeah,
Well, and in the
Joy.
oral tradition, that helps the memory,
right.
the repetition,
Yeah, yeah,
and particularly the rhythm.
right,
Mm-hmm,
right.
mm-hmm.
And the repetition of who these people are, like Linda's saying here, adds to the drama. These are really important people who have been summoned by the king. They're showing up for this big ceremony. We've got a band, right? We've got trumpets blowing and that's repeated too, right? So this is like a massive state ceremony. And these 3 young men they're just not playing along. So all this kind of worldly power, you know, the scene is about, with this repetition, all this worldly power, all the force, all the pomp and circumstance of the nation is present to honor the king and to do what he said, right? And they don't do it. All right.
Why do you think Daniel wasn't in on this?
Sorry?
Why do you think Daniel wasn't in on this?
No idea. Yeah, I really don't know why Daniel isn't mentioned here.
Daniel sat at the gate of the king. That's the end of the line in the chapter before that. It's like, it's kind of like Daniel was even over above all these other people, and
Yeah.
like the command to show up was sort of below his,
Didn't apply to him.
it didn't apply to him.
Yeah.
It was below him.
Right, that's, could be. But I really don't know, and I'm not sure there's a sort of definitive idea about why Daniel isn't mentioned in this story. Okay, one more word, and I'm going off my New Revised Standard here, and I did a quick count, so I may not have this exactly right, but I think the word worship or some form of it is used 10 times in this chapter. And that really drives the point home. You're supposed to worship the image of this king. Now, could we, I've got a reference here in a minute or two that will draw this closer to the present, but still, could we imagine living in that kind of environment where we are legally required to do something that fundamentally goes against our faith? And with big consequences, like you might, go to jail, you might lose your property, you might have to pay a big fine,
I feel like in our day and age, it's easy to separate out doing what the king said, bowing and not meaning it. You know what I mean? Like, just because you bend the knee to something now, I mean, I realize that that's not how things were seen. And maybe it's because we have a kind of dualism at play in our world where your heart doesn't have to be in it.
Well, and I
So
think
you're
that,
not really worshiping in that sense.
I mean, we can imagine there were quite a few Jews who decided, we're just gonna go along with this, we know it doesn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just go along with it.
Well, or even just regular citizens who think I don't know. It's hard to imagine that every single person believed that somehow this golden statue was gonna
Right.
provide any kind of favor.
They didn't have to believe anything.
Yeah.
They just had to bow down.
Mhm.
They just had to go through the motions.
Besides that, it was a
And-
problem.
Yeah.
And the king had to see him do it.
Mm.
Right,
Mm.
right.
I didn't realize they didn't all go back home till I was reading something about Esther recently. I just suppose when they got a chance, they all left,
Yeah.
but.
No, most of them actually didn't go back home. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so reading the story and noticing fairly closely some details like this, it starts to draw into higher relief parts of the story that we might just read over, read past without noticing. But I thought, okay, worship, some form is mentioned 10 times in 30 verses. That's quite a few mentions.
Mhm.
And of course, where it's mentioned is also strategically important. We've already talked about this really. How is King Nebuchadnezzar portrayed? He's kind of strutting his stuff, but it looks kind of silly because he's totally, nothing he commands turns out the way he said it was going to turn out. So it really is meant to make him look kind of silly, or maybe not silly perhaps, but certainly he does not have the power that he thinks he has.
He seems to be on kind of a short fuse too.
Yeah, right, yeah. Yeah, fly off the handle. Right.
Have anybody seen the VeggieTales episode of this?
No.
Rack Shack and Benny?
Veggie Tales.
I guess
What is
I it's Rack Shack and Benny it's just the name of the characters. But it's, if you ever seen any VeggieTales stuff, it's just great. And then it's just running through my mind because I used to, sit with my son when he would watch it as a young kid. So
Mhm.
that's the way I'm envisioning Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebi.
Now we have two things to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, just a little bit of background now. I'm drawing on John Goldingay's work here. And he makes this historical kind of generalization. A place called Dura, colossal gold-plated statues or monuments, dedication ceremonies, lists of state officials, the use of a variety of musical instruments, brick furnaces, and execution by burning are all known from the Babylonian or Persian periods. So the story in that sense really is rooted in things that actually happen. People know these things actually happen. Whether the way this story is told, that it happened exactly the way story tells it or not, is open to a range of interpretations. But stuff like this happened. And then setting up statues to honor the king was a common ancient Near Eastern practice. So what Nebuchadnezzar does is also easily recognizable. And then he makes mention of Daniel as a midrash. Now, this is a technical word, and basically what it means is a midrash is commentary on scripture. So in the Jewish tradition, you've got the biblical books, but then you have a bunch of other books that are kind of the standard sets of commentaries on scripture. And Goldingay suggests that maybe Daniel is like a midrash on Isaiah 43 verses 1 through 3. So let's turn to Isaiah 43, 1 through 3 and look at what it says there. And I'll ask for a volunteer to read.
This is from the New International Version. But now this is what the Lord says: He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name, you are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt for your ransom, Cush and Seba in your stead.
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah, so when you pass through the fire, you shall not be burned. Now, okay, you can imagine preachers and teachers taking this verse and, so to speak, making a kind of, not exactly a sermon, but developing a story like the one we just read or talked through to illustrate the truth of this point from Isaiah 43. We don't have to go too far with this. This is a scholarly kind of, an example of sort of a scholarly digging into some details and helping us understand what the purpose of a book like Daniel would be. Because remember, in the Christian canon, it's listed among the prophets, but in the Hebrew canon, Daniel is among the wisdom literature. So it's, when you put it over in that category, it significantly changes the starting point for thinking about how do we understand what we're reading here. So I think what I'm inviting us to do is perhaps broaden our sense of possible readings and developing our imagination in new ways, perhaps, to see the divine truth, you might say. What is God teaching us when we read the book of Daniel?
Well, especially with this story, I think back of why they're there in the first place is because they were unfaithful while they were in Jerusalem, in Israel. And here they are in captivity after, being punished. And yet these examples of four people, the Daniel and the three boys, living faithfully and being successful.
Right, yeah, that's exactly right. That would be a word, you know? If you're parents and you're growing up in this foreign land, you want your kids to do well, what are their options? Right? How are they gonna stay faithful to their God, to the God of Israel, who's everybody's God? It's very clear. How do you stay faithful and how do you make a good life, right? These are very much life kinds of questions. Do you think maybe turning off that heat would be?
I turned it down.
Yeah, okay. All right, here's a more close to home, our time analogy. Again, this is a quote in the Golden Gate commentary, but I thought it was another way of kind of stirring our thinking here a little bit. A German leader's observation in 1936. This is a quote. One cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God. But an arousal of faith in the eternal German is at the same time an arousal of faith in the eternal God. You see how being German and being Christian are getting just mushed together. If we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Führer, serves Germany. And whoever serves Germany serves God.
Is that a real thing?
That's very much, there's,
Did somebody really say that?
yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about the history of German Christianity during this period of time, but I do know a lot of us have heard about the confessing church.
Mhm.
So I think it was 1932, if I remember correctly. The Barmen Confession, these Christian pastors gathered to talk about how do we respond to National Socialism and to Hitler making these moves. And they became known as the Confessing Church, and they wrote a statement of faith. And they say in that statement of faith, as Christians, we worship God and not the state. So they really set themselves up to suffer for us, for a period of time. And a lot of people know the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He actually was in the United States and he went back to Germany to join with these pastors in resisting Hitler's moves. But a big part of the church, because remember that the Lutheran church, for example, in Germany would have been the state church.
Mhm.
And many leading theologians, I mean, some of the really famous Protestant theologians that we who go to seminary and learn how to quote theologians, we know their work and we quote them on occasionally. They went along with Hitler's regime. They were co-opted, they accommodated, and this statement gives a sense of what happened to the church. What really becomes more important is this kind of German spirit that gets identified with the Christian spirit. And, we know how that turned out. So that's it's a pretty dramatic example, but it is a good reminder that these things do happen. And there are parts of the world right now. Let's see, this is bad memory. This is one of those, I saw a little blurb about it, but didn't go any further. I think in the nation of Iran, it was either Iraq or Iran. Don't quote me on this, but something like 112 churches were shut down for, reasons that the state has. I think it was Iran. But this sort of thing is happening now where people, Christians are very much challenged to practice their faith. Yeah.
In China, there's this saying, prison is your seminary.
Uh-huh.
So many pastors go to prison.
Yeah.
And, Yeah. But yeah, Nigeria, the Congo, there are many places where Christians are killed, where their houses are burned, where if you've got a Bible, yeah, they'll come and burn your house, where women are raped. It's very sad.
Yeah,
It definitely still exists.
okay. Well, let's get on with Daniel 4 then. So when we get to Daniel 4, one thing we notice right away is the change from third person to first person. So let's look at Daniel 4. And
Daniel chapter 4?
yeah,
Daniel.
Daniel chapter 4. And let's do a similar thing, just kind of talk through it. Now it's quite a bit different from the stories we've read so far. So we don't have as much of a plot. What do we have?
It's like a speech.
Okay, yeah, it is like a public edict. Again, we can compare. There's an edict in chapter 3. And there's content and a tone and a purpose in the edict in chapter 3. And here it's another edict. And how does it read to you?
Can't think of the word I want, but it's like standing up in church and telling about their conversion and
The
that
testimony.
kind of, that's the word. Thank you.
Yeah, it sort of reads like a testimony. Yeah. So it's wildly different from chapter 3. Let's just think out loud a little bit about how chapter 4 following chapter 3, what kind of impact does it seem like it has to you then?
Seems like
It
it
seems
has
like,
impacted Nebuchadnezzar in some way.
yeah, I was
Okay.
gonna say the same thing. It was like he's almost humbled. And
Yeah.
and coming to recognize the power, well, obviously he recognized the power of the Jewish God. But you know, he's not it. He's not it
Right.
anymore.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go ahead and as I ask us to do occasionally, let's state what feels like the obvious, but there is a plot, so some things happen. What happens here? What, after we get this kind of, announcement that he's gonna share this testimony, basically, then what happens?
His astrologers, good guy, whatever, on his team or in his employ they can't interpret the dream.
Right.
They're totally inept.
Yeah, so Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And again, his team of magicians and enchanters and sorcerers cannot interpret the dream.
And he was totally happy and content until he had the dream. He was just a happy camper.
Good, yeah. Enjoying his kingship, okay.
This time he told them the dream, though. He didn't keep the
Right,
dream.
yeah.
He learned his
didn't-
lesson the last time.
Yeah, he didn't hide the dream from him, but they still couldn't tell him what it means. So what does he do?
It was in Daniel.
Yeah. Who are you gonna call? Daniel. And why Daniel? Yeah, go ahead. How is Daniel described?
It's the chief of magicians.
Yeah, that's kind of weird, isn't it? So
Yeah.
Daniel, this good Jewish boy, this faithful Jewish man, I should say, young man, is the head of the team of magicians, enchanters. But how is he described in like verse, what is it, 8?
Yeah.
You have the spirit of the holy gods in you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's an alternate reading that says a holy divine spirit. He has a holy divine spirit, but even the spirit of the holy gods. I mean, that's the way a pagan would think about.
Mhm.
Daniel has this gift. and Daniel attributes it to the one true God. But from from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, at least here at the beginning of this story, he puts it in terms that he knows. Okay, so dream, Daniel interprets the dream. And what is the tone of voice, so to speak, that Daniel uses in interpreting the dream?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm using the King James version at the moment, but it says in verse 19, then Daniel, whose name was Belshazzar, was astonied. Astonnied, a stone. What is that?
That's a misprint.
Are you sure?
I'm
It's not an Old English word?
No, I'm almost positive that's a misprint.
Okay, for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him.
Well, if that is a word, I've
I'm
never
gonna-
heard that
I'm gonna
word.
Google
Would
it.
that be the same as astonished?
Well, but it sounds like, almost like, yeah, I mean, it is astonished, but even to the point of kind of being speechless almost, yeah.
This
Mine
one says
says
greatly
dismay.
perplexed.
Yeah,
He was-
NIV says perplexed.
Perplexed,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know, I tend to use the word perplexed in not that strong a term. It is a
It's
word?
a word.
Okay, we're gonna learn something here, so what's the word?
And there's a how to pronounce it that I just skipped over, but definitions of astonied, it's an adjective, filled with the emotional impact of overwhelming surprise or shock.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, my golly. This is why you should never trust my generalization. Most of the time, I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay,
But the king then was concerned, I mean, my thought is what Daniel saw or what he knew the dream meant was not good news for the king. And so he was concerned about that, because if you tell bad news to a king, you go into the fiery furnace or something like that. And the king is gentle with, I know I
Yeah,
can't think of the
yeah,
word, he was
yeah.
kind, said, Daniel, it's okay,
yeah,
I want to hear what the dreams.
right. Yeah, Daniel says in verse 19,
One with one.
my Lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. But yeah, in this scene, Nebuchadnezzar comes across as almost chastened somehow,
Yeah.
But interested in the dream. Okay. Now, before we go on in the story, again, like the word worship in chapter 3, we have the repetition of some version of Most High God. It might be the Most High. It might be the one on high. But these, if you look at those verses, 2, 17, 24, 25, 32, 34, you're going to find references to the Most High God. So again, like in chapter 3 and in chapter 2, Yahweh, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, right? He is the one who is over everything. So once again, King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on the planet at that point, is not that big a deal compared to the one true God. And Most High, Most High, Most High God repeated drives that point home. Okay, so again, some questions. How are the magicians and enchanters characterized?
Incompetent.
Incompetent. Right. By comparison, how is Daniel characterized?
He's got the holy God with him.
Right. Endowed with the Spirit, wisdom, charismatic. Okay. Okay. I asked the question, how does the narrative differ here from chapter 2? We've really been hitting on some of that. There's a dream in chapter 2, and there's a dream in chapter 4. So obviously there's that sense. The dream in chapter 2 is about Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and then subsequent kingdoms. Here, there is no subsequent kingdom. It's about what's going to happen to this king, right? It's not going to be about years down the road. It's what's going to happen to you, king. And we'll get to what happens to Nebuchadnezzar in this chapter. But let's turn for a moment to Ezekiel 34 and look at the first 14 verses. There's a kind of implicit comparison. Now, Ezekiel's time frame is roughly the same as the time frame that these stories in Daniel are set in now, right? So we're talking somewhat early in the years of the exile. Or maybe up to halfway through the exile. But look at what is the metaphor that you see in Ezekiel 31?
Shepherds.
Okay, yeah,
Really bad shepherds. I mean,
okay.
Well, the
Ezekiel,
tree,
yeah, there's the tree.
oh. In
That's
Ezekiel?
that's sort of the
I'm sorry.
direct
Oh, I
kind of
was thinking it was
comparison.
exalted above.
Oh, good. I was thinking, oh, did I get the wrong? Because I'm double checking my references here to
No,
make
that
sure.
was me. I heard 34. That's what-
Yeah. Yeah, 31. So we have a tree
Mhm.
in chapter 31 of Ezekiel. What do we have in Daniel 4?
The tree.
We have a tree, right? And that tree's gonna get cut down. So there are similarities in description. In Ezekiel 31, it's Egypt that's represented by the tree that gets torn down. Now, historically speaking, who is it that tears down Egypt?
Babylon?
It's Babylon. That's
It's
right.
like,
I know the answer's
answer's
Jesus, but it looks like a squirrel to me.
Yeah, exactly.
So historically speaking, Babylon destroys Egypt, and the decisive battle that really ends Egypt as an empire. Now, Egypt continues, but much smaller. It's the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. And you can read about that in 2 Kings, for example. So boy, this is where when you start putting things together, I mean, again, from a Jewish perspective, if we know the scriptures, so Babylon, big bad Babylon, tears down big bad Egypt. And now, look now Nebuchadnezzar is sort of having the same kind of, the same image, more or less, or very similar image, is now applied to Nebuchadnezzar. And back to Daniel now. I put here on the screen, Daniel is a loyal subject because he addresses the king, I think, respectfully. Might be somewhat self-protectively, but he is a loyal subject. But he's also still the faithful prophet. Look at verse 25 and 27 in chapter 4 of Daniel. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the wild animals. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen. You shall be bathed with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdoms of mortals, and gives it to whom he will. And then in verse 27, therefore, O king, may my counsel be acceptable to you. Atone for your sins with righteousness, and your iniquities with mercy to the oppressed.
Steve, where are you reading from?
Daniel 4,
Okay.
verse now 27.
Okay. Sorry.
So he's in a very respectful way, he's still courageously calling the king to account. Again, this kind of picture of faithfulness in difficult situations, having the courage to speak the truth even to the king.
Well, and it's to their benefit, his benefit. I mean, he's got a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Although he's in exile and it's not what he would choose, it's better than some things.
Oh, absolutely. And he's got a powerful position in the government. He's living a good life in terms of material circumstances.
Isn't the king narrating this story?
Yeah.
Isn't Nebuchadnezzar
At the
telling
beginning.
story? Yeah, when did that change? When did
It
he
looks like
stop?
Right
around
in.
19.
Yeah, exactly. It
Okay.
switches to third person there.
Okay,
But then it comes back to the first person. Like in verse 34. Right?
yeah.
Okay, now, so again, the scholars have this question about if 7 periods of time is like 7 years, well, let me get to the point here. There's no historical record anyplace where Nebuchadnezzar falls into this kind of sickness. And there is something, there's a psychological malady called boanthropy, where a person thinks he or she is like a wild animal, in this case, a cow or a bull or something like that. And there are instances of this sort of thing happening. And stories of werewolves and things like that, you can kind of dig into the psychology. And the description in Daniel 4 is of some kind of condition that psychologists would call boanthropy. Now, I told you everything I know right there. So I'm not sure what kind of status this might have in the psychologist community or anything like that. But it definitely is there. Now let's look at Psalm 49:20. And I know we're out of time here, so I'm about to land the plane. 49:20. And in a number of places in the scripture, human beings who want to live life their own way, who demonstrate a kind of hard-hearted, leave me alone attitude toward God, get compared to wild animals, because that's kind of how we turn out. If we don't yield to the way God made us, we don't follow God's guidance, we're going to wind up acting like animals, living by our senses. So here is like the king again, kind of demonstrating that in big, dramatic ways. All right, now the question comes, are we reading an account of a king's conversion? And it's not the case that he becomes Jewish, but does he really come to believe in Yahweh as the one true God? And he, in that last kind of part of his testimony after chapter 34, verse 34, excuse me. There's actually, let's see here. It's in verse 34. I bless the Most High and praised and honored the one who lives forever, for his sovereignty is an everlasting sovereignty, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. If you go to Psalm 145:13, that's almost a verbatim quote. It's pretty close. And so we won't take the time to turn there, but Nebuchadnezzar is portrayed as becoming something of a believer in the one true God. Now, very quickly, I want to.
Well, that
Oh, that
very
was it.
quick,
Sorry.
that 34, verse.
Mhm.
I raised my eyes toward heaven and my sanity was restored.
Yep,
That's grace.
right,
Mhm. Mhm.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and this is another example of God loves all the nations, even the ones that destroy his people. And he's demonstrating real mercy and loving kindness, hesed, to this Babylonian king. All right. Well, that's chapters 3 and 4. So next week we'll do 5 and 6. And then the next week we're into the weird stuff. Yeah. All right. Well, it's good to see everybody. Take care. We'll see you next time.